I am Caleb Ward, and welcome to this conversation that I'm going to have with Alexis Pauline Gums. I am a postdoc at the University of Hamburg, I live in Berlin, but I'm actually currently sitting in the house that I grew up in Western Massachusetts, in the homeland of the Nipmuc people. And this is the first conversation of a series of interviews that we're going to do, supported by the Hamburg Centrum for Diversity and Gender. Um, and these are going to be conversations with scholars and activists and thinkers about the depth and nuance in Audre Lorde's thought and work. And I am very excited today to talk to Alexis Pauline Gums, who is a Black feminist, Caribbean American writer, teacher, poet, organizer, spiritual leader, activist, visioner. Alexis has authored several books of Black feminist prose poetry, a series that kind of builds and projects the kind of insights of individual Black feminist foremothers into visions for the future, and kind of renegotiating the relationship with the archive and the relationship with history and inheritance. And you should also see her most recent book, which kind of diverges from that series, which is called Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. So her creative writing work is visionary and acclaimed, but among scholars of Black feminism, her work is also has a kind of cult following for its just magical dealing with the archive. And her dissertation, which was finished 10 years ago and has not actually been published, is just a text that people who are studying Audre Lorde and June Jordan and Black feminism come back to again and again and again as kind of an text of the kind of scholarship that is possible and that can create a more personal relationship to the inheritance from these Black feminist figures. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I wanted to say that I'm really excited to see that work turn into this next project, which is called The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde, Biography as Ceremony. And that's going to be coming out in the next year or two, with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. So welcome, Alexis Pauline Gums, and thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for doing this series. And I am here in the land of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, sourced by the sacred Eno River, and currently often referred to as Durham, North Carolina.
So, Alexis, I feel like you are a bottomless repository of stories from Lorde's life. And you have this, especially this relationship with the material artifacts of her life that enables this kind of holistic view of how her ideas developed. I've seen you speak about the stones that she used to make necklaces, just the notes that she's jotted on the back of napkins and flyers, and um, the books that were her collection of books of her own writing that were damaged in Hurricane Hugo in our home in St. Croix. So I feel like through this kind of intimate relationship with the immediate kind of bodily life that she's had, you've become I would say you are perhaps the only or definitely the primary thinker of Lorde's spirituality, um,
Mm.
and a person who's bringing Lord's spirituality to the forefront of our engagement with her thought. So I'd be interested to hear if you could talk a little bit about how you see Lord's spirituality connecting with her politics, um, whether as a motivator or as something that actually shapes her practice.
Hmm. Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think that I don't know. I don't know if I'm an expert on on Lord's spirituality. I know that my relationship to Audre Lorde is a spiritual relationship for me. But if I were to describe Audre Lorde's spiritual approach, I definitely think it's an earth-based approach, or became an earth-based approach. We know that Audre Lorde grew up in Catholic educational contexts and religious Afro-Caribbean family. But in her life, she really developed this reverence for earth
Mm,
itself. So she would collect stones. She would find out what they were used for in different traditions. She would really study and think about animals and the stars and the meteor showers, what was going on in the sky. All of these things were things that she gave a lot of space for in her journals. The solstice, the equinox, the cycles of the moon. These are things that she was encountering in a number of different ways. And I would say that kind of like a, feminist goddess practice intersected with the research that she did on West African cosmologies, meeting up in this way where she was bringing those things together in terms of how she actually led her spiritual life, made her decisions, was able to think of her life beyond the narrowness of one lifetime or of a human society context. But I think that Audre Lorde was also very spiritually eclectic. We know she was working with I Ching Oracle. Um, and I think she was ultimately really fascinated by a number of practices that inspired her. And I heard, from one of her students that towards the end of her life, this student asked her, did she believe in an afterlife? And, what were her thoughts about that? And she said, I think jokingly, but you don't always know. Just because she's laughing doesn't mean she's joking. I was raised a Catholic and I'm going to heaven. So there's all of this range and space for maybe that's a different form of Catholicism, that a very, very inclusive spiritual approach. And so politically, I think that that meant that she was driven by this idea of an ethics that was ecological. And I think a very important aspect of her work that I don't necessarily think is discussed as much as we really need to discuss it, especially considering our own situation in relationship with this planet, is that Audre Lorde had a reverence for the earth and understood these concepts like the creative power of difference and um, the possibility of ethical relationship across the difference to be inclusive of all species, but also the planet itself. So Audre Lorde was practicing an ethics. So when she talked about the creative power of difference, when she talked about the dynamism of a simultaneous interpersonal experience, the way that she theorized that in her writing and in her life, it really was inclusive of difference across species. It was inclusive of geological time. It was an expansive understanding of participation in creation and accountability for destructive actions, not only on the scale of interpersonal relationships, but with actually the entire ecology. And there are a number of places in interviews where Audre Lorde emphasizes that, of course, she wants these technologies of relationship that she's theorizing in her work to make conversations possible between different groups of people. But if we don't actually activate that in relationship to the planet itself, there will be no place to have those conversations, right? That's something that she emphasizes to multiple interviewers, especially when she's in her 50s. So yeah, I think that if I had to make it very concise, I would say Audre Lorde practiced an eclectic earth-based spirituality that impacted her politics such that her politics resonated at the scale of the planet.
That's beautiful. So do you see her the kind of action she's taking against, in the name of survival in the face of anti-Black violence, both in her own life and, in her support for the anti-apartheid movement? Do you feel like that activism is continuous in a way with this project of the health of the planet and the sort of creating a home that will last on planetary time for human community?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there is a distinction between the sacrifice of Black life that she saw in terms of the apartheid movement and, in terms of racism in Germany and, resurgence of Nazism that she spoke about at the end of her life, and what she was doing in St. Croix in terms of being a fierce advocate against offshore oil drilling and understanding that these are there are structures that she called cancerous, and obviously there's a weight to somebody who is living with cancer using the metaphor of cancer to describe the society that she lives in. And so what she saw in terms of especially the leadership of women like Ellen Kusuayo in Soweto and, the sisters of um, the Maggie Magaba Trust was this sacred scale of livability that she did see in the practice of different Black feminisms across the planet. And so I wouldn't say that she was always thinking about this in the terms that I would articulate it in, but I do think that when you see the way she writes about it in her poetry, she's always bringing those things together.
Thank you. Yeah, this question, especially about the oil drilling, this image comes up in a few places in her writing where she talks about I think she's talking about it in the context of nuclear energy, actually, when she talks about putting things in the earth that will never break down, or
Mhm.
that somehow in planetary time are like a tumor, um, that can never be reintegrated into the earth. So sort of thinking those images, I have two M words, appropriately enough, given your M archive text. They're actually words that appear early in the pages of the M archive, but I think that they're really central in Audre Lorde's thought, and I'd love to hear you just think about them out loud. And those two words are metastasize, which we've already talked about a little bit, and metabolize.
Mhm.
So I'd love to
Mm.
hear you think those words in the context of Lord's thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's so interesting because, you know this and I know this, but everybody else might not know that in terms of nuclear policy, that Audre Lorde was protesting around issues of nuclear policy from when she was a college student and, continued to think about that, write about that, organize around that, mentor others to organize around that throughout her life. And there is this way that she thinks of human action out of alignment with the environment as something that is cancerous and that spreads and drains and kills. And at the same time, it's reciprocal, right? She thinks about her work of actually fighting cancer in her body as anti-apartheid work, like that. That's one of the ways that she talked about it to her doctor in Berlin. And so there's this idea that out of tune with the rest of the environment, there is this creation of um, structures that the earth can't actually sustain and hold. They're not porous enough for life to move through, and they cause these huge problems, right? Like offshore oil drilling does. And then there's how she sees her life force and her energy as something that is, in fact, being metabolized by the universe, right? When she talks about a burst of light, she's talking about life in this way where it is something that's renewable, not in the form of an individual life, but in the form of the energy that she's moving. And she sees her work with her poetry as energy work that she's doing. And she often talks about how she has this concept in her mind of this fount of life, right, that we pour back into after we die. And so seeing her own life as just this vessel that energy moves through, and that energy being renewable and something that is like everything else in the planet, cyclical and not ownable by an individual, she's contrasting that with how capitalism functions and what it means for multinational corporations to inject structures that only extract and don't offer something back that can actually become part of this whole. So I would say that metastasization, as opposed to metabolism, might be ways to think about that conflict that Audre Lorde really saw, and she began to actually believe that that's what she was experiencing on the level of her body, was the conflict between this imposed system and this will for life to be able to move through.
Thank you. Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, and in a way, this is not a metaphor, right? I
Quite
mean,
literally,
I mean, in
yeah.
some sense, it's a metaphor, but in some sense, it is quite literally her body going through the living out the sort of impact of what capitalism has done to the world and to the sort of food chain and stuff like that, the environment. Um, so this idea of her work participating, I have two directions that I want to go, and but we have time for both of them. Um, this idea of her almost like her knowledge practices participating in um, this wider re recycling and kind of generating of the earth. I feel like that's really visible in her narrative of her first experience of menstruation, when she
Mhm.
talks about this blood that is this going to be this sort of source of knowledge, that is available to her, or power. I think she says knowledge and power, as she is wont to do, that will be available to her. And I'm thinking in particular in Zami, but of course that piece also appeared elsewhere. Um, and I think that there have been some anxieties uh, around reading people today reading the feminists of the 70s, about this sort of spiritual feminine that seems to be drawn out, and the kind of fear of a gender essentialism, that might be underlying some of these views. So I'd be interested if you have advice for people who are reading Lorde and looking, and feeling kind of anxiety, caution around that. If there are places where we have to recognize limitations of her thought, because of this kind of view, or if there are places where we have to actually look closer and more deeply and see what it is she's actually trying to get at.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, my deepest wish is just that she was here, right? That's the thing. When our great thinkers have passed away, we can't ask them to then speak in the language that has developed since they were gone. And in this case, which has developed, maybe would not even have developed without their contribution, right, to our discourse. So I think there's a lot there. When I think about it, I I don't think that Audre Lorde would be a gender essentialist today. I can't know. But the reasons that I think that she would not be, from what she did in her lifetime, have to do with the fact that she really, I mean, she did all of this research to unpack the gender essentialism of Black cultural nationalism in the United States, right? So she would bring back all of these examples of different ways that people practice gender, different forms of body modification that had to do with people's roles they took on in society. She strongly identified with the idea of, Amazon warriors cutting off their breasts and being warriors in a certain kind of way. She was really interested in bringing this idea of the boy wives and the female husbands. All of these things were really important to a form of gender essentialism she was trying to disrupt and get free from, even in her own participation in the Black arts movement. So to me, that suggests that gender essentialism isn't something that she would want to hold on to. Also, of course, she aligns herself with the women of the Combahee River Collective, who specifically say that they don't believe in biological determinism and don't practice separatism for those reasons. And she has her own dialogues around lesbian feminist separatism that that are really core to how she moved in the world. And so those things suggest to me that if we were to talk to Audre Lorde today, she would not be claiming a gender essentialism that would harm the people whose freedom she has fought for and made possible. Um, I think that the idea of what a divine feminine is doing in her work is really seeking another way to be, right? It's seeking to unseat patriarchy, to acknowledge that there have been other ways that energy has moved. And I think that she also sees herself, the energies moving through her, as identified with her mother and identified with her father, right? And, in Zami and everywhere else, she really talks about the masculine and feminine energy that moves through her and that is so important to her. So then when we get to these ideas, what she's doing with the blood in the menstruation scene in Zami, it really is connected to what she's doing in that entire book, which is, I would say, a transubstantiation of her maternal legacy and her relationship to her mother. Like, what could it mean? She reaches a point in her life where she realizes, she's been pushing against her mother's own internalized racism, her mother's, strict discipline, and the things that she railed against growing up in her mother's home. And then she's realizing what she got, right? She's realizing that, oh, her relationship to language is so much influenced by her mother. She's realizing how I'm going to use the word queer, which is not the word that she used, but how queer the way that her mother moved in the world was, as a powerful woman who was breaking all these different norms that Audre Lorde didn't even know were norms, because her mother was the first person that she saw, right? And she is thinking about the lesbianism of her mother, using lesbian not to mean specifically an identity where somebody partners with other people who identify as women, but as some kind of way to describe how she saw her mother's reality as something that pushed against heteronormativity in a way that Audre Lorde benefited from, and a legacy that she's in, right? So then to turn to the blood and this menstrual moment that is based in Audre Lorde's life, but we know it's a biomythography, and she sometimes refers to it as a novel and as Audre as the character. So there's room for her to go back to that scene and create this lineage and inheritance and energy transfer between her and her mother that I don't think she was able to recognize was happening until she also had her own children, until she had other life experiences and even other experiences with her mother that allowed her to see that. So I think that what we witness in that scene is Audre returning to a moment in her puberty and to her relationship with her mother to really honor a connection that she didn't know how to honor when she really was that age. And I think that's so powerful. We also see her do that work in terms of her relationship with her father, who she looks just like, and who, at the end of her life, she realizes had a secret family that she never knew about before she was born. And she starts to link it to how has she been in her relationships, and what has her relationship to her sexuality been, and her relationship to other women been, right? So she's doing that work, and it is gendered because she's aligning it with her mother and her father. But I don't think that she's trying to reproduce a gendered essentialism. I think that she's finding something very sacred in her own femininity that she's making space for. And I think that's what's so useful and exciting about this work. I guess my advice would be, we'll never find out. I mean, we know that the people that Audre Lorde mentored, who I interview and who I am in relationship with, they themselves are not gender essentialists, and they're not practicing the harmfulness of TERFism. Like, that's something that we know, which also suggests that that's where she would be if she were here. But I think the more important thing is to really look at Audre Lorde as a theorist of energy, and a person who was theorizing energy in a way that is actually even more expansive than what we have terminology for now, let alone what she had terminology for then. And that to me is really exciting. It's also a challenge, as somebody writing about her. But I'm also a poet, because I do have to imagine that there's energy we can move beyond the terminology we have.
Thank you. That is a wonderful answer. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love that sort of challenge because of course she says in a very specific context, she sort of prickles at being labeled as a theorist. And I think it has to do with the view that you can strip this sort of energy of actually living out and just be left behind with, just the ideas. And of course, there are no new ideas that can save us. It has to come from the feeling and come up with the energy. I'd love to talk a little bit more about this. So you just gave this really rich discussion of her inheritance from her parents. And I think you're totally right that she begins to circle back to these battles as she's going through life as a mother and experiencing her relationships with her children. And I feel like in her poetry, there's this there's not only this renegotiation of her relationship with her mother, and this sort of, when we talk about metabolism and specifically metabolism and metastasization, she has to figure out what to do with like her mother's colorism that she inherited, or her father's silences. But at the same time, there's this kind of looking ahead from the perspective of her daughter, especially her daughter, but also her son, and how the next generation will or will not be able to take up whatever she has given to them, and whatever, her generation, the people who have developed um tools and sources of energy for survival in one season may know those the season will change, and the shape of our lives, people's lives that are facing the oppression, it'll be a different shape in the future, and it could be that all of those tools just need to be rejected or something. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about this sort of like structure, or well, the kind of like not so much her personal relationship with her children, but what she sees as this transmission that's supposed to happen from her generation of Black feminists onward. Um, and maybe there are lessons there. I really deeply believe there are, for all social movements, all attempt to transform the status quo. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this sort of futural direction of inheritance in her thought.
Yeah, definitely. I think that she really was always working on an intergenerational scale. And, this is why you see quotes from her children as the epigraphs to her poetry books, and this idea of the children as something expansive, like that she really felt as a teacher, but also as a person situated in time and believing in energy beyond time, to really think about those possibilities. I'm thinking, like, when you were phrasing that question, I was thinking about Prologue, and um, the way that through that poem she moves from this idea of like the undead and the old voices and how are we honoring our ancestors and can my brothers and sisters hear me, to the fact that it's actually good news that her legacy is something that she won't have control over, and that, you know, the grass that grows, which is the children of the future, are going to have this other context that she doesn't have to be attached to and like controlling of in its outcome. And I see it, connected to Black studies, where she really is thinking through what is it to teach. And, you know, obviously, as we know, she was involved in the creation of Black studies in the United States, and was constantly in meetings with other colleagues in the University of New York around what would that be, what would that mean, in solidarity with the students who had demanded that they must have Black and Puerto Rican studies. And she is doing this work about like, what has she learned, right? What is the English language doing inside of her? Is it a demonic force? Is it, the lines on her hands and her relationship to language becomes something that's like haunted? And both of those poems are definitely poems of haunting. But then she gets to this place where, soon we will not need you, mother, only your memory teaching us questions, right? And that she will have these questions about what will they grow for food, what will they carve for weapons. She can never answer those questions. She just actually has to be an expansive enough memory to teach the questions that they will be able to then work with on their own in the conditions that they face. And you see different versions of that. You see it in her poetry after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You see these generational, I would call it a generational generosity, like a real insistence and a rigor around not, even though she loved to give advice, and she totally told younger people what to do, like all the people who were like, she was like, you need to write your book and you need to go to grad school, all the things that, it's not to say that she wasn't invested in what people younger than her did. It's just that she was also really curious. And she also did not think that she would be able to understand all of it, what was going to be generated in the future. And that she was really like, she shouldn't be able to understand it, right? That's what would mean that they weren't just reproducing the same harmful cycles that she herself was trying to find a way out of and kind of open a portal out of. So I think that the the reality is Audre Lorde, somebody living with cancer for more than a decade, obviously thinks about their legacy, right? And they have all of these encounters and these moments where they understand that they are participating in things that are hopefully going to outlive them, and they're not going to necessarily see the end of them. But I will say, as somebody who has read the middle school notebooks of Audre Lorde, she was thinking about legacy from a kid. Like she was somebody who thought on that intergenerational scale from very early in her life. And I think that was actually part of her relationship to language and to poetry. And she wondered about that in this sci-fi piece that she wrote when she was like 14. Like what happens with the light if there are people who don't know how to receive it? Like that was something that she was already thinking about, using language that's like the same language that she'll use in A Burst of Light, her very last work of autobiographical prose. So I don't necessarily think that there's like a settling. We can see things that are consistent across the way that Audre Lorde thought about intergenerational impact. But I think the most important thing is like that's really where the juice and energy was for her, right? That's why it was so exciting to meet the young women in Berlin who were creating the Afro-German movement and the Afro-German feminist movement. It was so exciting because it was like they actually hadn't even occurred to her really before she started this correspondence, where she was like, oh, I really want to know, like, what are they like? What are they doing? And this like intense focus where she's like studying pictures from, the conference in Zurich before she gets there so she can embrace Ika as soon as she first meets her, because she's like studying the future and so curious about it and so honored to play any part in what future generations will create, but in this sense that, yes, she's drawing on her experience, she's drawing on her connections, she's trying to support people, she's believing in them more than they believe in themselves. The amount of Black women in Europe who were like, and then Audre Lorde had me translate. I'm not even a translator, but she was like, you can do it. And then like, just started, without, full consent, but also because of this deep belief that everybody's going to grow, and that she wants to contribute to that. So yeah, I think that also speaks to what it means to have an earth-based ethic, right? You would say that practitioners of an earth-based spirituality or indigenous forms of ethics are thinking seven generations back and 7 generations into the future, right? And that really does describe the way that Audre Lorde was thinking, not necessarily identifying with an indigenous framework, but absolutely being taught by solidarity with different folks who were living in that framework. And there's a lot of reach to that. I feel included in that, and I also feel accountable to an intergenerational, metabolization and offering that this energy that we can refer to as Audre Lorde is continuing to generate beyond what she could imagine, beyond what I will be able to imagine, and beyond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll ask you one last question. In a way, you just brought everything together in such a beautiful way. And I kind of want to just sort of like tie the bow and be like, yes, and read the book. But I do want to ask, on this sort of face-to-face level in the classroom, this is the question of how this long scale cross-generational inheritance can be shepherded along, especially when she's working with other Black women, other Black lesbians, other poets, like women of color poets, but also just in the classroom in general, where she was often, she talks about this sort of drain of trying to teach white students in the City University of New York, the teacher college, where she's supposed to teach these white teachers in training how to interact with Black and Puerto Rican students and Dominican students, and it's just like a total drain. Um, so do you have a sense that she has a kind of a pedagogy that she develops through her life? I mean, beyond this sort of demand for self-scrutiny, which I think is the starting point, for all people, scrutinize what is of meaning for your life and how it is connected to others. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about her pedagogy, because especially as all of these lecture notes are being published and archival work is kind of pulling together this material that
Yeah.
gives us an insight into that.
Yeah, I think it's so great. I think it's so great to have the transcripts of the classes in Germany, and the CUNY archival work is so awesome. And talking to Audre Lorde's students has been one of the great, great, great joys of writing this biography for me. And some of these students have been my direct mentors since long before. So Audre Lorde's pedagogy. So there's no origin point, right? We're always learning. We're always thinking about learning. We're actually always teaching. And this is something also that Audre Lorde writes about, that there's not a separation. But when Audre Lorde was a kid and she met that first Black librarian, um, Augusta Baker, the great librarian Augusta Baker, who was the children's librarian at the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library when Audre Lorde's mother used to take her and her sisters there. That encounter was so important and so formative. And Augusta Baker was the granddaughter of a storyteller, right? She believed in storytelling. She believed in reciting poetry. Then we learned that this is how Audre Lorde says she learned to talk, was like reciting this poetry directly because of the influence of Augusta Baker. And then we track that all the way to Audre Lorde becoming a librarian and secretly stashing, publications relevant to the Black young people in Mount Vernon that were not part of the library's collection to give to them when they came in the room, and were being policed by the other librarians for being too loud, too Black, too young. And how can they not be young Black people? So she has this gratitude for Augusta Baker that moves through what she decides to do. And then, as she describes it, when she goes as a poet in residence to Tougaloo and she works with those students to create their poetry publication, Pound, that is also when she's like, oh, I'm a teacher. Like I really am a teacher. I really am a poet. I was identifying as a librarian, but she loved that classroom. And I don't know, I mean, I can't read those. She kept those student evaluations. So they're part of her archive now. And it's just like, oh my gosh. Like if you could get your students to say things like they just so much love, so much like gratitude. They were just like, can she come back? Can she stay longer? Like she opened us up to things we couldn't even imagine. She supported us so deeply. And then when you see the publication they created, it's like, how did she create a space where these students at a historically Black college in the mid-60s would write about mental illness, about deep poverty, about like controversial, gritty, dirty things, not anonymously, but like put their names on it and publish them. That itself speaks to what was the space of truth telling and bravery that she held for them. And she was really activated by their truth telling and by their bravery in a huge way. And so her teaching career, I would say, comes out of the way that those students impacted her and showed her that something was possible. And then she's in the SEEK program, and she's working with the students who've been underserved by the New York City public school system. She's working at Lehman with the white teachers who are not trying to hear it, and she really talks about feeling like they felt like she was their enemy. The white students at Lehman who were becoming the teachers that you mentioned for a majority Black and Puerto Rican set of schools that they would be going into. And it's interesting to see how she yet doesn't give up those tools, right? She adapts her syllabi about systemic racism and then continues to teach it at John Jay when she's working with this mix of students that are police officers and that are newly included students of color who are interested in criminal justice and legal justice and transforming it or participating in it, whatever that may be. She's adapting the same work, and she doesn't actually give up her pedagogy, even though she feels like it was like such a fight and such a drain, and she doesn't necessarily feel like it succeeded with those teachers in training at Lehman. To think it's more successful when your students are police officers is deep, first of all. But I think she really did feel that way. And at a certain point, she really wanted to focus on teaching poetry. And it kind of comes full circle, like back to a space where poetry is the center of what they're doing, as opposed to composition, which had been the center of what she was doing in her role at John Jay. All that is to say, self-scrutiny is definitely a key part of her pedagogy, but also institutional analysis and understanding of systemic oppression is also a very core part of her pedagogy that moved with her, and that I think is an important part of understanding the consistency of Audre Lorde's socialism. Like she has the students reading James Boggs at John Jay. That's like the one core required text, right? You're thinking of somebody who's re-theorizing what it means to be a Black worker coming out of Detroit. And there are other things, but that's the consistent text that she brings over and over again. And I think that's very important, because I think that there are times when, and I don't think this is a coincidence, where people do remove Audre Lorde from a systems analysis by saying, well, like she's, by really focusing on the interpersonal and the ideas and identity itself. And like the authors of the Combined River Collective Statement, she really did think of identity as something that was never removed from these structures, and that was actually produced within a systemic frame, and that had everything to do with capitalism and how racism was useful for capitalism, all of that. So I think that's really important to say, that she was responsive and adaptable as an educator, and she was practicing a pedagogy of presence. She would change what they were talking about on a particular day based on what was going on. Clifford Glover, when Thomas Shea killed Clifford Glover, that was something where she was like, we have to talk about this differently, because this is what police do. Like all of this, like it's so profoundly relevant for the setting that she was teaching in. Or when Eleanor Bumpurs was killed, all of these things, her students talk about her coming in and framing what she's doing that day based on what's actually happening in the world and what she feels her students need to be aware of. And at the same time, grounded in this deep relationship to systems, and wanting them to have an analysis of systems and to understand that the individual experiences that they're having are in relationship with these systems, which also keep everybody in the room who are of different backgrounds connected to each other through the possibility of reproducing or transforming those systems. So I think that's something that's really important about her pedagogy. And then I think there's something like an intimacy and a mothering that her students talk about, and that has a huge, huge impact in terms of what I mean. There's like mother figure, there's older sister figure, there's different ways that people talk about Audre Lorde's example, but I think that she was profoundly interested in her students and curious about them. It's like she was really interested. Like she would write once in her journal, she wrote like, "How come I write more of my kids' dreams in here than my own dreams?" You know, because she was fascinated. Like, whoa, Elizabeth had this dream, you know, and so I think that attention is an important part of her pedagogy, like her honest curiosity about people that could, yes, she wanted to insist that people scrutinize themselves, but also her curiosity about people made them more curious about themselves too, and their relationship with the world around them. And yeah, her students talk about her putting them in a circle, her wanting everybody to face each other, her really thinking about how did they relate to each other in that room as something that was important as they learned about how they were related to each other through these larger systems. I mean, obviously Audre Lorde is teaching me after the fact, and I feel like she's a great teacher from my own experience, but learning about her through the eyes of her students and her mentees is phenomenal. I mean, I really understanding that we know of, Audre Lorde was the first person teaching about systemic racism to police officers ever, right? Is revolutionary in terms of just what that means in terms of the content of what she was teaching. But then when you understand who she was as an educator, the energy she brought to that part of her calling as an educator, you see how something like that becomes possible. You know, like you see how the essays that she kept where police officers were writing their critiques of the police system and writing about how they feel, like how sad they feel as Black police officers, for example. It's just, I mean, I'm in awe of what kinds of spaces for inquiry she really made possible for the students who worked with her. And I don't think that can ever be removed from the fact that she modeled it. She didn't stop learning. You know, she didn't turn it off within herself. And I think that that's what allowed her to make that level of inquiry available.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the way that your answer, I mean, I love the way that this is moving between these sort of structural relationships, systemic, like historical, intergenerational, the earth,
Well,
property relations, all of this. And then, but the scale of revolution is in this moment of feeling deeply in the student, you know, the moment of feeling deeply and recognizing that the students, you know, are they're the source of they're the sort of agent of imagination, which can start to create something else, you know, once you're gone, like in terms of the going forward. So I feel like this sort of love for the student, or love for the future possibility that the student can dream or can imagine or can sort of work toward, it motivates a kind of writing and a kind of teaching that that creates a space in which that kind of reflecting and imagining can happen. And so I feel like the thing that I wish for you and appreciate from you is how your writing is trying to do this and is doing this and your way of sort of grappling with the archive and the inheritance from these Black feminist foremothers, you know, opens up a space for all different people to renegotiate their relationship or to redirect our attention toward something different that we're not paying attention to, to connect our the environment and animal life to the dynamics that we are living out day in day out with racist kind of repetition of injustice. So I guess I want to say thank you so much for having this conversation and for opening up more synapses for new ways of thinking about Audre Lorde's thought and work. And thank you also for doing your scholarship and writing the creative story, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde, that will continue kind of creating new possible futures of her thought and new ways of engaging with this this complex inheritance. So I appreciate very much having you here, and I can't wait to see where your work goes next.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited about where your work goes next, and the the attention that you pay to Audre Lorde's thought is really important. I see it as a mirror for that, for that nearsighted Audre Lorde, bringing the stones so close to her face so she could really understand their complexity. I feel like that's how I think of what you are doing, and I know that it honors her, and as it should.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.